The thunder cracked like a bullwhip across the Arizona sky, as Mackenzie James clutched her sodden shawl tighter around her shoulders, watching in horror as the mountainside gave way. The torrent of mud, rock, and uprooted trees cascaded down with unstoppable force, obliterating the narrow trail, her only path back to Agua Caliente, and the life she'd built for herself after 2 years of struggle and determination. Mackenzie had ridden out to deliver medicines to old Mrs. Larson at her remote cabin when the storm hit. Now, as she stood in the rain beside her nervous mare, she realized she was stranded on the wrong side of the newly formed wall of debris. The year was 1879, and in the unforgiving territory of Arizona, being cut off from civilization could be a death sentence, especially for a woman alone. "Easy, Belle," she murmured to her horse, running a hand down the animal's wet neck. "We'll figure this out." The rain continued to fall in relentless sheets as Mackenzie weighed her options. The main pass was gone, buried under tons of earth and stone. Going around the mountain would take days if it was possible at all, and she had provisions for only one night. Turning back to Mrs. Larson's wasn't feasible either. The elderly woman barely had enough food for herself and had been bedridden with fever. As Mackenzie stood contemplating her dire situation, a voice called out from behind her. "Miss, you'd best get away from there. More could come down any minute." Turning, she saw a tall figure on horseback emerging from the rain-swept pines. The rider's face was partially obscured by a wide-brimmed hat, but as he drew closer, she made out the features of a man roughly her own age. His strong jaw was covered with several days' growth of beard, and his eyes, clear and blue as a summer sky, studied her with concern. "I need to get back to town," Mackenzie replied, raising her voice above the rainfall. "I'm the apothecary there. People are expecting me." The stranger dismounted with the fluid grace of someone who'd spent his life in the saddle. He approached the landslide cautiously, examining its scope. "No way through here, madam. Not for days, maybe weeks." He turned back to her. "Name's Ryan Wayland. I've got a cabin about half a mile back." "Not much, but it's dry." Mackenzie hesitated. She was 22 years old and had learned the hard way to be wary of strangers, especially men in these parts. But the rain was turning colder and nightfall wasn't far off. "Mackenzie James," she replied finally. "I'd be grateful for shelter until morning. By then I can decide what to do." Ryan nodded, not pressing her further. "Follow me, Miss James. Watch your step, the ground's treacherous after a downpour like this." They rode in silence through the gathering dusk, the only sounds the squelching of hooves in mud and the continued drumming of rain through the pine branches. After about 15 minutes, a small log cabin came into view in a clearing. It was modest but sturdy-looking, with smoke curling from the chimney. "You have someone staying with you?" Mackenzie asked, surprised by the smoke. Ryan smiled slightly. "No, madam. I left the fire banked this morning. Habit from living in these mountains. Weather turns fast." He helped her dismount, though Mackenzie was perfectly capable on her own, and led both horses to a small lean-to stable attached to the cabin. Once the animals were settled, he escorted her to the door. The interior was simple, but surprisingly neat. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its fire indeed still glowing with banked coals. A wooden table with 2 chairs stood in one corner, a narrow bed in another, and shelves lined with books, tools, and provisions occupied most of the remaining wall space. "It's not much," Ryan said, almost apologetically as he added wood to the fire. "It's dry," Mackenzie replied, "and that's what matters at the moment." She removed her drenched shawl and hung it near the fire, then stood awkwardly, unsure of her place in this stranger's home. Ryan seemed to sense her discomfort. "I've got some coffee and beans. Not fancy fare, but hot." "Thank you. I'd appreciate that." Mackenzie watched as he moved about the cabin with easy familiarity, setting a pot of coffee on the stove and stirring beans in a cast iron skillet. "You said you're the apothecary in Agua Caliente?" Ryan asked as he worked. "Yes, for the past 2 years." She accepted the tin cup of coffee he offered, grateful for the warmth between her palms. "Before that, I was apprenticed to Dr. Ferguson in Tucson." Ryan nodded. "Explains why you were out visiting old Mrs. Larson. Not many make the trek to check on her." Mackenzie raised an eyebrow. "You know Mrs. Larson?" "Know most folks in these parts, though not many know me." There was something in his tone, not quite defensiveness, but a practiced distance. As they ate the simple meal of beans and johnny cake, Mackenzie studied her host covertly. His hands were calloused but clean, his movements deliberate and efficient. He wore no gun that she could see, unusual for a man in these territories, but there was a rifle propped by the door. His clothing was worn but well maintained. "What brings you to these mountains, Mr. Wayland?" she asked finally. He seemed to consider her question carefully before answering. "Quiet, mostly. Spent years driving cattle up from Texas. Decided I'd had enough of dust and noise." "You're a cowboy, then?" A half-smile touched his lips. "Now I'm just a man trying to live simply." "And what do you do for money out here all alone?" "I hunt, trap some. Do odd jobs when I go into town. I don't need much." He looked at her directly now. "And you, Miss James?" "Most women your age in these parts are married with children, not mixing remedies." Mackenzie stiffened slightly. "I prefer independence to marriage, and I'm good at what I do." Ryan nodded, not challenging her statement. "Fair enough. We all choose our paths." The rain continued through the night, drumming on the cabin roof. Ryan insisted Mackenzie take his bed while he made a pallet by the fire. Despite her exhaustion, sleep came fitfully as she lay listening to the storm and pondering her predicament. Morning brought a temporary break in the rain, but revealed the full extent of the disaster. When they rode back to examine the landslide in daylight, Mackenzie's heart sank. The entire trail was gone, replaced by a massive wall of mud, rocks, and trees that stretched hundreds of yards in either direction. "There's no way around?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. Ryan surveyed the scene with a practiced eye. "Not safely, not for miles. And even then, the terrain's too rough for most horses." He turned to her, his expression thoughtful. "How urgently do you need to get back?" "I have patients waiting," she said, thinking of young Tommy Wilson with his croup and old Mr. Daniels with his rheumatism. "And my shop, I can't just abandon it." Ryan studied the mountainside for several long moments, then pointed to a narrow ridge about 50 yards above them. "There's an old game trail that runs along that ledge, if it's still there and if it can be widened." He trailed off, considering. "You could make a path?" Mackenzie asked, hope rising in her voice. "Maybe. It would take time. Days, probably." "I can't ask you to do that," she said, though a part of her desperately wanted to. Ryan turned to her, his blue eyes serious. "You're not asking, I'm offering. Folks in town need their medicine woman." He paused. "But it means you'd have to stay at my cabin while I work. I understand if that's not acceptable to you." Mackenzie weighed her options quickly. Stay with a stranger or attempt a dangerous journey around the mountain alone. "I can help," she said finally. "I'm stronger than I look." A smile ghosted across Ryan's face. "I don't doubt it, Miss James, but this is pick and shovel work on unstable ground. One wrong move could bring down more of the mountain." She recognized the logic in his words, frustrating as it was. "Very well, but I insist on making myself useful at your cabin." "That's fair," he agreed. We'll need to stop in at Mrs. Larson's first, let her know what's happened and make sure she has supplies. The elderly woman was surprised to see them both but understood the situation immediately. "You're welcome to whatever I have," she told Mackenzie. "Though it ain't much. We'll manage," Ryan assured her. "I'll bring you more firewood before I start on the trail." As they rode back to the cabin, Mackenzie felt a curious mixture of anxiety and resignation. "How long do you think it will take to clear a path?" Ryan considered. "With good weather, 4 or 5 days, if it keeps raining." He left the sentence unfinished. 5 days with a stranger in a one-room cabin. 5 days away from her shop, her patients, her carefully constructed independent life. Mackenzie squared her shoulders. She had faced worse challenges. "I'll need to gather herbs while I'm here," she said. "If I'm delayed, I should at least restock my medicines." Ryan nodded. "These mountains have plenty. I can show you where to find what you need." And so began their unexpected coexistence. The rain returned that afternoon, keeping them confined to the cabin. Mackenzie immediately set about organizing her space, clearing a corner where she could dry and prepare the herbs she would collect. Ryan watched her with quiet amusement as she rearranged his simple belongings. "Something funny, Mr. Wayland?" she asked when she caught his expression. "Ryan," he corrected. "And no, not funny, just different. Been a while since anyone but me moved anything in here." The domesticity of the situation struck her suddenly, a man and woman sharing close quarters, arranging a living space together. In any other context, they would be assumed to be married. The thought brought heat to her cheeks. "I'm sorry if I'm imposing," she said stiffly. "You're not," he replied simply. "Place could use a woman's touch." The words hung between them, loaded with unintended implications. Ryan cleared his throat. "I just meant it's nice, having company." That evening, as they shared another simple meal, Mackenzie found herself studying Ryan more openly. His quietness wasn't sullenness or stupidity, as was often the case with silent men. Rather, he seemed to consider his words carefully, speaking only when he had something to say. "Have you always lived alone?" she asked. He looked up from his plate. "Not always. Grew up with family in Missouri, lost my parents in '65 after the war, been mostly on my own since." "I'm sorry," she said, meaning it. "I lost my father in the war too, Confederate side." Ryan nodded. "Union for my father. Funny how that doesn't seem to matter much anymore." "And no wife, children?" The question was presumptuous, but her curiosity got the better of her. A shadow crossed his face. "No, came close once. She decided a cowboy's life was too uncertain." He took a sip of coffee. "What about you? You mentioned choosing independence over marriage." Mackenzie set down her fork. "My mother remarried after my father died. Her new husband had expectations of me that I refused to meet. When I turned 18, I left." She didn't elaborate on those expectations, but Ryan's expression suggested he understood. "So you apprenticed with a doctor?" "Yes. Dr. Ferguson was progressive enough to take on a female apprentice. I learned everything I could from him, saved every penny, then moved to Agua Caliente when I heard they had no doctor or apothecary." "Brave move for a young woman alone." She lifted her chin. "Necessary move. I prefer earning my own way to the alternatives." Ryan studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Respect that." The rain pounded the roof through the night, but by morning it had slowed to a drizzle. Ryan rose early, preparing for his first day of work on the trail. "There's food in the larder," he told her as he gathered tools. "I'll try to be back before dark. Lock the door while I'm gone." "I'm not afraid of being alone," Mackenzie assured him. "Never thought you were. But there's wolves and mountain lions that get bold in bad weather." After he left, the cabin felt surprisingly empty. Mackenzie busied herself with organizing her meager possessions. then turned to the practical matter of their living situation. She swept the rough wooden floor, wiped down the table, and inventoried the food stores. Ryan kept a tidy home for a bachelor, but there were improvements to be made. When the rain stopped entirely around midday, she ventured out to gather herbs, staying within sight of the cabin as Ryan had requested. She found yarrow, elderberry, and wild mint growing among the pines, carefully harvesting what she needed and bringing them back to dry by the fire. The physical work and fresh air cleared her mind, helping her accept her situation. She might be delayed in returning to town, but she wasn't helpless or in danger. And Ryan, for all his mysterious solitude, seemed to be an honorable man. As the afternoon light began to fade, Mackenzie heard the sound of hoofbeats approaching. Relief flooded through her, surprising in its intensity. She hadn't realized how much she'd been anticipating Ryan's return. He dismounted slowly, his movements suggesting exhaustion. His clothes were mud-splattered, his hands raw from hours of work. "How did it go?" she asked as she helped him unsaddle his horse. "Found the game trail," he replied, rolling his shoulders to ease stiff muscles. "It's narrow but solid. Started clearing the first section. With good weather tomorrow, I should make decent progress." Inside the cabin, Mackenzie had prepared a stew from dried meat and the few vegetables Ryan had stored. His eyebrows rose in surprise at the sight of the meal and the newly ordered cabin. "You didn't have to do all this," he said, washing his hands in the basin she'd prepared. "I told you I'd make myself useful." She ladled stew into a bowl for him. "Besides, it kept me from worrying about my shop." Ryan accepted the food gratefully. "Tell me about your work," he said after several hungry bites. "What made you choose healing?" The question was thoughtful, not the usual skepticism she encountered about a woman in medicine. Mackenzie found herself opening up as they ate. "My grandmother was a healer. Not formally trained but knowledgeable about herbs and remedies. When I was a child, I would help her gather plants and prepare medicines." She smiled at the memory. "After she died, I kept learning. Books when I could get them, observation when I couldn't." "And the people in Agua Caliente trust you. I know small towns can be suspicious of newcomers, especially women in unusual roles." Mackenzie laughed without humor. "Oh, there was plenty of suspicion at first. The mayor's wife suggested I might be a witch. But when influenza swept through town that first winter and I was the only one who knew how to bring down fevers and ease breathing, attitudes changed quickly." Ryan nodded. "Results speak louder than prejudice eventually." "What about you?" she asked. "You said you were a cowboy. Why leave that life for?" "This," she gestured to the simple cabin. Ryan was quiet for a moment, staring into his coffee as if the answer might be found there. 10 years on the trail changes a man. Dust and danger and the constant movement it wears on you. I wanted quiet. Peace." He looked up at her. "Started building this place 3 years ago, been adding to it bit by bit." "It's well made," she observed. "You have skill with your hands." A faint smile touched his lips. "Kind of you to say." That night, despite Mackenzie's protests, Ryan again slept on a pallet by the fire while she took his bed. She lay awake long after his breathing had deepened into sleep, wondering about this solitary man who had so readily offered help to a stranger. The next day dawned clear, a blessing after so much rain. Ryan left at first light, taking tools and provisions for a full day's work. Mackenzie, determined to contribute more, ventured farther from the cabin to gather additional herbs and check snares Ryan had mentioned. To her satisfaction, one held a plump rabbit which she cleaned and prepared for their evening meal. She spent the afternoon preparing tinctures and salves from the herbs she'd gathered, using small jars she found on Ryan's shelves. The familiar work calmed her. creating a sense of purpose in her unexpected exile from town. When Ryan returned that evening, even more mud-covered than before, his eyes widened at the sight of the rabbit stew bubbling over the fire. "You've been busy," he remarked, the appreciation clear in his voice. "As have you," she replied, noting the new calluses forming on his hands. "How is the trail progressing?" "Better than I expected. The old path is more solid than it looked." He washed up before joining her at the table. "If the weather holds, I might finish sooner than I thought." The news should have pleased her unequivocally, but Mackenzie felt a surprising twinge of something else. Not disappointment, surely. She was anxious to return to her life, her work. "That's excellent news," she said, covering her confusion with a bright smile. "I'm sure my patients are wondering what's become of me." "Town probably thinks you've finally run off with one of your suitors," Ryan said, the corner of his mouth quirking up. Mackenzie nearly choked on her stew. "My what?" Ryan's smile grew. "Come now, Miss James. A capable, independent, beautiful woman like yourself must have admirers in Agua Caliente." The compliment caught her off guard. That is." She composed herself. "Any such admirers know my position on marriage." "Which is?" "That I value my freedom and my profession too much to surrender either to a husband who would inevitably expect me to abandon both." Ryan considered this as he ate. "Seems to me the right man wouldn't ask you to surrender anything." "Perhaps," she conceded. "But I've yet to meet such a man in Agua Caliente." The look he gave her was unreadable, but it sent an unexpected warmth through her chest. That night, their conversation continued longer than before, ranging from their childhoods to their views on the changing territories. Ryan, she discovered, was well-read despite his frontier life, with thoughtful opinions on everything from politics to poetry. It was nearly midnight when they finally retired, both reluctant to end the easy flow of conversation. The third day of Ryan's work on the trail was marked by a new development. Mid-morning, as Mackenzie was hanging herbs to dry, a rider approached the cabin, a young man she recognized from town, Billy Harkins, who sometimes delivered mail to outlying areas. "Miss James." He called, clearly surprised to see her. "Everyone in town's been worried sick about you. As you can see, I'm perfectly fine," she assured him. "Just caught on the wrong side of the landslide." Billy glanced around, taking in the cabin and her comfortable presence there. "This is Wayland's place, ain't it? Never thought he'd have company." Something in the young man's tone made Mackenzie bristle. "Mr. Wayland has been kind enough to offer shelter while he works on clearing a path through the debris. I expect to return to town within days." Billy nodded, but there was a knowing look in his eyes that suggested he'd drawn his own conclusions. "I've got mail for him, and I can take any message you want back to town." Mackenzie quickly penned a note explaining her situation and listing patients who would need attention in her absence, addressing it to Mrs. Thornton, the midwife who sometimes assisted her. As she handed it to Billy, she noticed his curious gaze still sweeping the cabin. "Is there anything else, Mr. Harkins?" she asked pointedly. "No, madam," he replied, though his expression suggested otherwise. "Just glad to see you're safe. I'll let folks know." After he rode off, Mackenzie stood for several minutes, a sense of unease washing over her. The young man's visit had abruptly reminded her of the realities waiting in town, including the inevitable gossip that would now spread about her staying at Ryan Wayland's cabin. When Ryan returned that evening, she told him about Billy's visit. "The whole town will be talking by sundown," she said, unable to keep the worry from her voice. Ryan set down his tools with deliberate care. "Does that bother you?" "Of course it bothers me." Mackenzie paced the small cabin. "I've worked for 2 years to build a reputation based on my skills and professionalism. Now I'll be the subject of saloon gossip and women's whispers. Would it help if I rode into town with you when the path is clear? Explain the situation." She paused in her pacing. "That's kind, but it might only fuel more talk." Ryan considered this. "What if I spoke with Reverend Davis? He's respected. If he understands there was no impropriety." The suggestion was sensible, but Mackenzie felt a flash of irrational anger. "So my reputation depends on a man's word." Again. Ryan's expression softened. "No, your reputation depends on the work you've done for 2 years, the people you've helped. This will be a 9-day wonder, then forgotten when the next bit of gossip comes along." His calm reasoning penetrated her anxiety. "You're probably right," she admitted, sitting down at the table. "I'm overreacting." "Your concerns are valid," he countered, joining her. "But I think you underestimate how much the town values you." His confidence in her standing touched Mackenzie deeply. This near stranger seemed to understand her value in a way few others had bothered to. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything you're doing." Ryan's eyes held hers for a long moment. "It's nothing you wouldn't do for someone else in need." That night, their conversation was more subdued, but also more personal. Ryan spoke of his dreams for his mountain home, expanding the cabin, perhaps adding more land for cultivation. Mackenzie shared her hopes for her apothecary, including plans to train others in basic medical care. "You could do that here," Ryan said suddenly. "Train people, I mean. These mountains are full of families who never see a doctor." The idea was intriguing. "I've thought of making regular rounds to outlying homesteads," she admitted, "but I barely have time with my duties in town." "You'd need help," Ryan suggested. "Someone to mind the shop while you traveled. Are you offering?" The words slipped out before she could stop them, teasing but with an undercurrent of seriousness that surprised her. Ryan's eyes met hers across the table. "I might be, if asked properly." The moment stretched between them, laden with possibility, before Mackenzie broke the tension with a nervous laugh. "I think we're getting ahead of ourselves, Mr. Wayland." "Ryan," he corrected gently. "And maybe we are, but sometimes getting ahead of ourselves is how we find our way forward." The 4th day of trail work brought more progress. Ryan returned with news that he could now see clear to the other side of the landslide. "Another day, maybe 2, and it'll be passable for horses," he reported as they shared a dinner of venison stew, the result of Ryan's early morning hunting. Mackenzie felt the same conflicting emotions: relief at the prospect of returning to her life, and an unexpected reluctance to leave the peaceful routine they'd established. "You've worked so hard," she said. "I don't know how to thank you properly." "No thanks needed," Ryan replied. "Though I won't say it hasn't been pleasant having company." That evening, as rain returned in a gentle patter against the roof, they sat closer to the fire than usual. Ryan had pulled out a worn deck of cards, and they played several hands of poker, betting with beans instead of money. Mackenzie proved surprisingly skilled, winning more often than not. "Where did a proper apothecary learn to play cards like that?" Ryan asked after she took another hand. Mackenzie smiled mischievously. "Dr. Ferguson believed in a complete education. Said I should know how to spot a cheat as well as a fever." Ryan laughed, the sound rich and warm in the small cabin. "He sounds like a wise man." He was. She gathered the cards to shuffle again. "What about you? Who taught you to build trails and cabins?" "Necessity, mostly. When you're on your own, you learn or you don't survive." He accepted the cards she dealt. "My father taught me the basics before he left for the war. The rest I picked up along the way." As the night deepened, their conversation drifted to more personal matters. Ryan spoke of his time driving cattle north from Texas, the camaraderie of the trail hands, the endless horizons. Mackenzie shared stories of her early days in Agua Caliente, the challenges of establishing herself as a woman alone in a frontier town. "Were you ever afraid?" Ryan asked. Those first days in town, Mackenzie considered the question honestly. "Terrified," she admitted, "but never enough to turn back. Fear only matters if you let it stop you." Ryan nodded slowly. "Wise words. Wish I'd understood that sooner in life." "What do you mean?" He was quiet for a long moment. "After the war, after losing my parents, I let fear drive me. Fear of putting down roots only to lose them again. Fear of caring for people who might leave." His eyes met hers across the table. "That's the real reason I'm out here alone. Not because I love solitude, but because I was afraid of losing more." The confession hung in the air between them, raw and honest. Mackenzie reached across the table, placing her hand over his. "And now?" she asked softly. "Now," he said, turning his hand to clasp hers, "I'm starting to think some things are worth the risk." The touch of his hand, warm and calloused against hers, sent a current through Mackenzie that had nothing to do with fear. For a wild moment, she imagined leaning across the table, closing the distance between them. A log shifted in the fire, breaking the spell. Mackenzie withdrew her hand, her cheeks flushed with heat that wasn't entirely from the flames. "It's late," she said, rising from the table. "You have another long day tomorrow." Ryan stood as well, his expression suggesting he felt the same pull she did, the same reluctance to end the moment. "You're right. Good night, Mackenzie." It was the first time he'd used her given name. The sound of it in his deep voice followed her into sleep, coloring her dreams. The 5th day of Ryan's work on the trail brought triumph. He returned earlier than usual, his face alight with satisfaction despite the exhaustion evident in the set of his shoulders. "It's done," he announced as he entered the cabin. "The path is clear all the way through, narrow in spots but safe for a careful rider." Mackenzie felt her heart leap and sink simultaneously. "That's wonderful news," she said, trying to sound purely pleased. "We can leave tomorrow." Ryan nodded, washing trail dust from his hands and face. "At first light if you're ready." "Of course," she replied automatically. Then more genuinely, "Ryan, I can't thank you enough. What you've done, the work, the risk, it's extraordinary." He shrugged, but his eyes were warm as they met hers. "Seemed the right thing to do." That evening had a bittersweet quality, both of them aware that it was their last night in the cabin together. Mackenzie had prepared a special meal with the last of their provisions, a stew richer than usual, with dumplings on top and the last of the dried apples for dessert. "Quite a feast," Ryan remarked as they ate. "You'd make some man a fine wife, Miss James." The old comment would have rankled, but from Ryan, it felt different, an appreciation of her skills rather than a reduction of her worth to domestic abilities. "Perhaps," she replied with a small smile, "but he'd have to be an exceptional man to make me consider the position." Ryan's eyes held hers. "Naturally." After dinner, they sat before the fire, neither seemingly eager to retire despite the early start ahead. The silence between them was comfortable yet charged with unspoken thoughts. "What will you do when you get back to town?" Ryan asked finally. "Check on my patients, reopen the shop, explain my absence." She sighed. "Face whatever gossip Billy Harkins has stirred up. And after that, will things go back to how they were before?" The question seemed to reach beyond her daily routine to something deeper. Mackenzie stared into the fire, considering. "I don't know," she admitted. "Some things feel different now." Ryan nodded slowly. "For me as well." Another silence fell, this one more weighted than before. Mackenzie gathered her courage. "Will you come to town sometimes? Not just when you need supplies, but to visit?" Ryan's expression softened. "I'd like that, very much." "Good," she said simply, feeling a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. Later, as she lay in his bed for the final night, Mackenzie found herself wide awake, listening to Ryan's breathing from his pallet by the fire. 5 days ago, he had been a stranger. Now he was. What? Not quite a friend. Not quite something more, but definitely someone who had carved a place in her life as surely as he had carved a path through the landslide. Morning came with clear skies and birdsong. They prepared for departure in companionable silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Mackenzie packed her few belongings, along with the herbs and medicines she'd prepared during her stay. Ryan saddled their horses, checking and double-checking the tack. As they mounted up to leave, Mackenzie took a last look at the cabin that had been her unexpected refuge. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything." Ryan's eyes were steady on hers. "You're welcome back. Anytime." The journey to the newly cleared path took about an hour. When they reached it, Mackenzie could finally appreciate the full extent of Ryan's labor. The trail was narrow but level, painstakingly cut into the mountainside above the mass of debris. In places, he had constructed crude but effective supports from fallen trees to stabilize the path. "This must have been exhausting work," she said, awed by the effort it represented. "Worth it," Ryan replied simply. They rode single file along the narrow trail, Ryan leading the way. In the tightest spots, they dismounted and led their horses carefully. By mid-morning, they had reached the other side of the landslide and could see the main trail to Agua Caliente stretching before them. Mackenzie felt a surge of emotion relief at the familiar path home, gratitude for Ryan's extraordinary effort, and a wistful sadness that their time together was ending. As they remounted and prepared for the final leg of the journey, she found herself searching for words to express these conflicting feelings. "Ryan," she began. "I don't know how. You don't need to say anything," he interrupted gently. "I understand." And somehow, she believed he did understand not just her gratitude, but the deeper currents that had developed between them during their brief time together. They rode at an easy pace toward town, conversation flowing more naturally now that the tension of departure had passed. Ryan spoke of his plans for the coming month's improvements to his cabin, hunting trips before winter set in, perhaps a journey to the territorial capital for supplies. Mackenzie shared her concerns about patients she'd missed seeing, preparations for the cold season ahead, ideas for expanding her medicinal garden. As they rounded the final bend, and Agua Caliente came into view, both fell silent. The small town looked unchanged, the same dusty main street, the same wooden buildings, the same wisp of smoke from the blacksmith's forge. Yet for Mackenzie, something fundamental had shifted in her perception. "Where is your shop?" Ryan asked as they approached the outskirts. "End of Main Street, next to the general store. The building with the blue door," he nodded, guiding his horse in that direction. People on the street stopped and stared as they passed. Mackenzie heard whispers and saw pointing fingers, but lifted her chin and rode straight-backed beside Ryan, refusing to show embarrassment or shame for a situation that required neither. When they reached her shop, several women were gathered outside, including Mrs. Thornton, the midwife. They surged forward as Mackenzie dismounted. "Oh, Miss James, we've been so worried," exclaimed Mrs. Thornton. "Young Billy said you were stranded but safe. We've been taking turns checking your shop and caring for your most pressing cases." "Thank you," Mackenzie said warmly, genuinely moved by their concern. "I appreciate your help more than I can say." The women's curious gazes shifted to Ryan, who remained mounted, slightly apart from the group. "This is Mr. Wayland," Mackenzie introduced him. "He offered shelter after the landslide and spent 5 days clearing a new path through the debris so I could return." Mrs. Thornton's eyebrows rose slightly, but her voice was respectful as she addressed Ryan. "That was mighty good of you, Mr. Wayland. The town owes you a debt of gratitude." Ryan tipped his hat. "No debt, madam, just neighborly help." The other women murmured appreciation, though Mackenzie could see speculation in their eyes. She decided to address it directly. "Mr. Wayland's cabin has 2 rooms," she lied smoothly. "He was a perfect gentleman throughout my stay." The falsehood came easily in the face of potential scandal, though she felt Ryan's surprised glance. The women nodded, seemingly satisfied with this explanation. As the group began to disperse, with promises to return later for a full accounting of her adventure, Ryan finally dismounted. He tied his horse to the hitching post and helped Mackenzie unload her saddlebags. "2 rooms," he murmured, amusement in his voice. "A necessary fiction," she replied quietly. "Small towns thrive on gossip, but they respect propriety, even invented propriety." Ryan nodded, understanding. "Well, I should be going. Let you get settled back in." Mackenzie felt a sudden panic at the thought of him riding away. "Won't you come in? I can offer coffee at least after the journey." He hesitated, then shook his head. "Better not. Give the gossips time to cool down." His eyes softened as they met hers. "But I'll be back. For supplies in a week or so." "I'll be here," she replied, trying to keep disappointment from her voice. Ryan looked at her for a long moment, as if memorizing her features. Then, surprising her, he took her hand and raised it to his lips in a brief, gentle kiss. "Until then, Miss James," he said softly, releasing her hand and mounting his horse in one fluid motion. Mackenzie stood outside her shop, watching until he disappeared from view, her hand still warm from his touch. The week that followed was a blur of activity as Mackenzie re-established her routine. The shop needed cleaning, supplies required organizing, and patients came in a steady stream, both for treatments and out of curiosity about her adventure. She told the story many times, always emphasizing Ryan's heroic effort to clear the path and his perfect propriety as a host. To her relief, the town seemed to accept her explanation, or at least pretended to. Mrs. Thornton and several other prominent women made a point of visiting her shop together, a public display of support that effectively silenced the worst of the gossip. But as the days passed with no sign of Ryan, Mackenzie found herself growing increasingly distracted. She caught herself glancing toward the door whenever it opened, hoping to see his tall figure. At night, alone in her rooms above the shop, she found herself missing the sound of his breathing, the comfort of his presence. 8 days after her return, just as she was closing the shop for the evening, the door opened. Mackenzie looked up from her ledger and her heart leapt. Ryan stood in the doorway, hat in hand, looking somewhat out of place in the neat confines of her shop, but undeniably welcome. "Mr. Wayland," she said, unable to keep the pleasure from her voice. "You're later than expected." "Had some business to attend to," he replied, stepping inside and closing the door behind him. "Hope I'm not interrupting your closing." "Not at all," she set aside her ledger. "Can I help you find something? Herbs, liniment?" Ryan smiled slightly. "Actually, I came to ask you something." "Oh." Mackenzie felt her pulse quicken. "There's a social at the church this Saturday. Dancing, food." He cleared his throat. "I was wondering if you might consider attending. With me." The invitation was unexpected but not unwelcome. Still, Mackenzie hesitated, thinking of the town's gossip. Barely settled, Ryan seemed to read her thoughts. "I've spoken with Reverend Davis, as I suggested. Explained the situation. He's invited me to the social himself." The deliberate way he'd gone about ensuring her reputation remained intact touched Mackenzie deeply. "In that case," she said, a smile spreading across her face, "I would be delighted to attend with you, Mr. Wayland." "Ryan," he reminded her gently. Ryan, she repeated, savoring the name. The church social proved to be a turning point for both of them. Mackenzie wore her best dress, a modest blue gown that nonetheless drew an appreciative look from Ryan when he called for her. He, in turn, had clearly made an effort with his appearance, wearing clean, pressed clothes and boots polished to a shine. The townspeople greeted them with varying degrees of curiosity and warmth. Reverend Davis made a point of welcoming Ryan enthusiastically, introducing him to prominent citizens and mentioning more than once the heroic effort he had made to clear a path after the landslide. "You'd think I'd single-handedly saved the town," Ryan murmured to Mackenzie after one such introduction. "In a way you did," she replied. "You saved their apothecary at least." When the dancing began, Ryan surprised her with his grace. For a man who had spent years in the saddle and more recently wielding picks and shovels, he moved with surprising elegance across the floor. "Where did you learn to dance like this?" Mackenzie asked as he guided her through a waltz. "My mother insisted all her sons learn," he replied with a small smile. "Said no woman wants a man who can't move to music." "Your mother was wise," Mackenzie laughed. As they danced, she was aware of eyes on them but found she cared less than she might have expected. The feeling of Ryan's hand at her waist, the warmth of his presence, seemed more important than any whispered commentary. Late in the evening, when the music had slowed and many of the older couples had departed, Ryan led her outside for a breath of air. The night was clear, stars scattered like diamond dust across the velvet sky. "Thank you for coming with me tonight," he said, his voice low in the darkness. "Thank you for asking me," she replied, equally soft. They stood in silence for a moment, the muted sounds of the social continuing behind them. "Mackenzie," Ryan began, then paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. "These past 2 weeks have been unexpected." "Yes," she agreed, her heart beginning to race. "They have. I came down from my mountain to get supplies that day. Wasn't planning to speak to anyone beyond what was necessary for trade." His voice had a wondering quality. "Instead, I found you standing by that landslide and somehow everything changed." Mackenzie turned to face him fully. "Changed how?" Ryan's eyes, reflecting starlight, held hers. "I've been alone by choice for 3 years. Thought it was what I wanted, what I needed." He took a deep breath. "Now I'm not so sure." The confession hung in the air between them, vulnerable and honest. Mackenzie felt her own carefully constructed walls beginning to crumble. "I've been independent by necessity," she said finally. "After what happened with my stepfather, after seeing my mother surrender her will to a man who didn't deserve it, I swore I'd never put myself in a position where I relied on anyone else." She stepped closer to Ryan. "But perhaps there's a difference between relying on someone and sharing with them." Ryan reached out slowly, giving her time to retreat if she wished, and took her hand in his. "I'd like to find out, if you would." The moment stretched between them, full of possibility. Then Mackenzie made her decision. She leaned forward and gently pressed her lips to his. The kiss was brief but unmistakable in its meaning. When she pulled back, Ryan's expression was one of wonder and dawning joy. "Is that a yes?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "It's a beginning," Mackenzie replied, smiling up at him. In the weeks that followed, Ryan and Mackenzie carefully navigated the transition from strangers to something more. He took rooms in town, finding work with the local ranchers while maintaining his cabin in the mountains. Mackenzie continued her apothecary business, but now found time for regular rides into the countryside, sometimes alone, often with Ryan as her guide and companion. Their courtship was unconventional by the town's standards. Ryan respected Mackenzie's independence and her dedication to her profession. Rather than trying to change her, he sought ways to support her work, building shelves in her shop, constructing a greenhouse behind it for her more delicate herbs, accompanying her on trips to outlying homesteads where she provided medical care. For her part, Mackenzie discovered that her fear of losing independence was gradually being replaced by appreciation for partnership. Ryan never asked her to be less than she was. Rather, he seemed to delight in her strength and capability. 3 months after the landslide, on a crisp autumn day, Ryan took Mackenzie riding into the mountains. They followed the trail he had carved through the debris now settled and beginning to sprout new vegetation, and continued to his cabin. The small structure looked much as she remembered it, though Ryan had clearly made improvements in the intervening months. A proper porch now fronted the building, and a second small building stood nearby, a workshop, he explained, for his woodworking projects. Inside, the cabin had been expanded with a new room added to the back. The main room was still familiar: the stone fireplace, the wooden table, the shelves of books and supplies, but it felt more finished, more intentional. "You've been busy," Mackenzie observed, running her hand along a beautifully crafted shelf. "Had motivation," Ryan replied, watching her explore the space that held such significant memories for them both. When she reached the new room, Mackenzie paused at the doorway. Inside was a small but well-designed space with a window facing east toward the sunrise. Along one wall stood a workbench with racks for drying herbs, shelves for jars and bottles, and a cabinet with small drawers labeled for various medicinal ingredients. It was, she realized with a shock, an apothecary's workspace. "Ryan," she breathed, turning to him in question. He stood in the doorway, expression both hopeful and vulnerable. "I had an idea," he said, "about those folks in the mountains who need medical care but rarely get to town." Mackenzie nodded, beginning to understand. "You built this for me, for my work, for our work," he corrected gently. "If you want it to be." "What are you suggesting?" she asked, though her heart was already racing ahead to an answer. Ryan took a deep breath. "I'm suggesting a partnership. You maintain your shop in town, but we also create an outpost here, a place where mountain families can come for help, where you could work when you visit." He paused, then added softly, "where we could build a life together. Are you asking me to marry you, Ryan Wayland?" Mackenzie's voice was steady despite the emotion surging through her. "I am," he confirmed, moving closer to take her hands in his. "But I'm also asking you to be my partner in every sense. I don't want a wife who gives up her calling. I want Mackenzie James, apothecary and healer, who happens to also be my wife." Tears pricked at Mackenzie's eyes, not of sadness but of a joy she'd never expected to feel. This man, who had spent a week carving a path through debris so she could return to her independent life, had now carved a space for that life within his own. "Yes," she said simply, her voice thick with emotion. "To all of it, yes." Their wedding, 2 months later, was a blend of traditional and unconventional elements, much like their relationship. Held in the town church with Reverend Davis officiating, it drew nearly the entire population of Agua Caliente. Mackenzie wore a practical but beautiful dress of deep green rather than traditional white, with herbs from her garden woven into her hair instead of a veil. Ryan stood tall and proud beside her, his quiet strength a perfect complement to her vibrant energy. Their vows, written together during long evenings of discussion, reflected their unique partnership. "I take you not to possess but to cherish," Ryan promised. "Not to diminish but to elevate. I vow to support your dreams as fervently as my own, to respect your independence while offering my steadfast companionship." "I take you not in surrender but in partnership," Mackenzie returned. "Not in fear but in trust. I vow to share my strength with yours, to build alongside you rather than behind you, to love you with the fullness of who I am." The celebration afterward, held in the town square, continued well into the night. Even Mrs. Thornton, who had initially been among the most concerned about propriety, raised a toast to a most unconventional but perfectly suited pair. As the years passed, Ryan and Mackenzie built the life they had envisioned together. They divided their time between her shop in town and their expanded cabin in the mountains. The small apothecary workspace Ryan had built grew into a proper clinic that served the scattered families in the high country. What had begun as a landslide forced collaboration developed into a medical outreach program that improved health outcomes throughout the region. In the spring of 1882, their first child was born, a son they named Thomas, after Dr. Ferguson, who had given Mackenzie her start in medicine. 2 years later, they welcomed a daughter, Elizabeth, named for Ryan's mother. Both children grew up with an unusual education, learning both traditional academics and practical skills medicine from their mother, construction and ranching from their father. The path Ryan had carved through the landslide became a permanent trail, widened and improved over time, known locally as Wayland's Way. It served as a fitting metaphor for their lives together, a route created through determination and hard work, connecting two worlds that might otherwise have remained separate. On the 5th anniversary of the landslide, Ryan and Mackenzie rode out together to the spot where they had first met. The debris had long since been covered by new growth, nature reclaiming what had been disturbed. Only the carefully maintained trail remained as evidence of the catastrophe that had brought them together. "Do you ever think about how different our lives might have been if that mountain hadn't come down?" Mackenzie asked as they sat on a fallen log, overlooking the valley below. Ryan considered the question, his arm around her shoulders. "Sometimes, I might have stayed alone up here for years more. You might still be guarding your independence in town." "Both of us thinking those were the only choices," she mused. "Instead, we found another way," Ryan said, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Our own path." Mackenzie leaned into his embrace, feeling the solid strength that had first attracted her to him, now familiar but no less precious. "A better way," she agreed. As they rode back home to their children, their work, their shared life, Mackenzie reflected on how a disaster had become the foundation for unexpected joy. The landslide that had blocked her path home had led her to a different kind of home altogether, one built on respect and partnership rather than traditional expectations. And Ryan, who had spent a week carving a trail through debris so she could return to her independent life, had ultimately helped her carve a new definition of independence itself, one that included love without requiring sacrifice, partnership without demanding surrender. It wasn't the life either of them had planned. It was better,